For most of my career, I believed a status report was the one thing in a company you could trust. Numbers don't have feelings. A project is on track or it isn't. That belief is probably why I lasted as long as I did, and it's definitely why I got into trouble. One morning, I sat in a review and watched a flagship program get reported to leadership as green. On schedule, on budget, a clean, confident slide. And I knew, because I'd seen the working files myself just hours earlier, that none of it was true. The program was slipping badly. The dashboard said one thing. The actual numbers said another. So I did what I'd always told my own teams to do. I raised it, calmly, in writing, through the proper channel. I assumed it was an oversight someone would want corrected. The reply came back fast and cold. It's handled. You don't have the full context. 3 weeks later, I was pulled off my biggest project. A month after that, a performance review I'd never worried about in 20 years suddenly questioned my judgment. I hadn't changed. My work hadn't changed. The only thing I'd done differently was tell the truth about a number. So why had telling the truth made me the problem? Let me back up, because that question only makes sense if you understand who I was before I asked it. I was a senior program manager at a company that built complex systems on long timelines. The kind of work where a single program runs for years and 100 smaller decisions either keep it honest or quietly bury it. I've been there a long time. 2 decades of shipping things, of standing in front of leadership and telling them the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. That was, I always thought, the whole point of my job. Anyone can report good news. They pay people like me to tell them when the news is bad, early enough to do something about it. I had a reputation for being calm and exact. I kept meticulous records, dated notes, saved versions, a habit of reading every status report line by line instead of just glancing at the color. People sometimes tease me about it. A program is green. Why are you reading the appendix? Because, I'd say, the color is an opinion, and the appendix is where the facts hide. I believed that completely. I had built an entire career on the idea that the numbers, if you actually read them, would always tell you the truth. So I want you to understand, when this started, I wasn't suspicious of anyone. I trusted the system I worked inside. I trusted that if a report was wrong, the people above me would want to know, the same way I'd want to know. That trust is the thing this whole story slowly took apart. It began on an ordinary morning. There was a flagship program, not mine to run, but adjacent to my work, close enough that I saw the real numbers regularly. That morning I'd been in the working files, the actual schedule and cost data, and they were ugly. The program was behind. Costs were running over. Scope was quietly eroding in the way that always precedes a missed delivery. None of this was secret to anyone who looked. You just had to look. Then I sat in the leadership status review, and the same program came up on a clean slide, reported green. On schedule, on budget, confident. I remember blinking at it, the way you do when someone tells you it's sunny while you're watching rain hit the window. The dashboard and the working files could not both be right. And I had read the working files myself, that morning with my own eyes. I told myself it was a lag. Reports get built ahead of time. Maybe the slide was stale. Maybe someone hadn't pulled the latest data. That's the charitable explanation, and I genuinely believed it. So I did the thing I told my teams to do 1,000 times. I documented it calmly and specifically, and I raised it through the proper channel. A short, factual note pointing out the gap between the reported status and the underlying numbers, with the figures attached. No accusation, no drama. Just, these don't match, and someone should probably reconcile them before this goes any further up. I hit send and went back to work, fully expecting a thank you and a correction. What I got was a reply that came faster than any real investigation could have happened, and several degrees colder than the situation called for. It's handled. You don't have the full context. That was most of it. A couple of sentences. The message wasn't really about the numbers at all. It was about me, about the fact that I'd asked. I read it a few times. The strange thing, the thing I kept snagging on, was that no one actually told me my numbers were wrong. Nobody said, "You misread the data," or "Here's the context you're missing." They just told me, in so many words, that this wasn't mine to raise. Stay in your lane. Focus on your own scope. The program isn't your concern. And that's a peculiar response, if you think about it. If my numbers had been wrong, the easiest thing in the world would have been to show me why. Correct the record, send me on my way, done. Instead, the energy went entirely into the fact that I'd spoken up. They weren't disputing the message. They were managing the messenger. At the time, I didn't have language for that yet. I just felt the wrongness of it, a small cold note that wouldn't stop ringing. I let it go. I want to be honest about that. I had my own work, a long career's worth of reasons to assume good faith, and a quiet voice telling me not to be the difficult guy who couldn't let something go. So I filed it away and moved on. Then, a few days later, without explanation, I was removed from a key project I'd led for months. The reasons given were reasonable on their face. Bandwidth, wanting fresh eyes, a reshuffle that, I was assured, had nothing to do with anything. And maybe, in another month, I'd have believed it. But the timing sat wrong in my stomach. I led that work cleanly. There was no failure to point to, no client complaint, no missed milestone. There was just a sudden decision, framed as routine, to take it out of my hands. And then I noticed something smaller, the kind of detail you only catch because you read everything. I've been quietly dropped from the distribution list for the flagship program, the very program whose numbers I'd flagged. Not a meeting reschedule. Removed. The reports I've been reading for over a year simply stopped arriving. If you want to make sure a person couldn't keep noticing a discrepancy, that's exactly how you'd do it. You'd stop showing them the discrepancy. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'm an even-keeled person. Paranoia isn't my natural state. But the facts were stacking in a direction I didn't like, and then one more landed on top of the pile. My annual performance review got scheduled early. In 20 years, my review had never once been early. It came in its season like weather. This one was moved up, with no particular reason given. I went into that review expecting the usual. I came out of it not recognizing my own career. For 2 decades, my reviews have been strong, steady, substantive, the record of someone people relied on. This one had a different temperature. Suddenly, there were concerns about my judgment, questions about whether I was collaborative, a line about raising issues unconstructively. None of it pointed to a single concrete failure. No misdeliverable, no botch call, no example you could actually examine. It was all behavioral, all vague, all the kind of language that's impossible to disprove because it isn't about anything you did. It's about how someone has decided to describe you. And it contradicted everything in my file before it. That was the part that finally woke the analyst back up in me. You can't be the same person doing the same work at the same level for 20 years and then become a judgment problem in a single quarter. Not without something changing. And the only thing that had changed was that I'd sent one honest note about one dishonest slide. So I did what I do. I stopped feeling and started documenting. I pulled my own files, every dated note, every saved version, the whole quiet archive I'd been keeping for years out of pure habit. And I laid 3 dates side by side. The date I sent my written concern about the program. The date I was removed from my project. The date the language in my review turned. They lined up, not loosely, tightly. The project removal and the sudden judgment concerns both began within 3 weeks of my report. Not before. There was nothing in the prior 20 years that hinted at any of it. The whole new story of me as a difficult, questionable employee had a start date, and that start date was the moment I told the truth about a number. I went further because dates alone can be argued with. I had kept the original email, the actual note I'd sent, with its timestamp, with the figures attached. I had the calendar entry for the review that got moved up, and I could see when it had been created, which was days after my note, not in its usual season. I even had my prior reviews, years of them, in my own saved folder, so I could set the old language next to the new and watch the tone change overnight. Each piece on its own was a date. Together they were a story, and the story only made sense one way. I sat with that timeline for a long time, because a timeline like that changes the nature of the thing. A bad review is an opinion. You can argue about an opinion forever, but a sequence of dated events is a fact. And these facts said, plainly, that I hadn't become a problem. I've been made into one, on schedule, right after I became inconvenient. Still, I held the line with myself. One person's bad quarter, however suspiciously timed, is not proof of a pattern. I had spent my career refusing to call a single data point a trend, and I wasn't going to abandon that discipline now, just because it was finally my own data. If this was a method and not a moment, it would have happened to someone else. So I thought about who else had ever raised a hand about that program and then quietly disappeared from it. I thought about Cole. Cole had been a capable, well-liked colleague who, about a year before me, had started asking pointed questions about the same flagship program. I remembered it vaguely. A few tense meetings, then Cole going quiet, then a sudden run of friction, and within a year Cole was gone, off to another company, with the general impression left behind that he just hadn't worked out. At the time, I'd accepted that story without examining it. People leave. Sometimes they don't work out. I'd had no reason to look closer. I reached out carefully. I didn't lead him. I just asked whether anything strange had happened with his reviews near the end. There was a long pause, the kind where someone decides whether to reopen a wound. Then he told me, and it was my own story read back to me almost word for word. He'd raised concerns about the program's numbers. He'd been told he lacked context. He'd been quietly pulled off key work. And then his review, strong for years, had turned on a dime. Vague concerns about attitude and judgment. Nothing concrete, impossible to fight. I spent a long time thinking I'd finally screwed up somehow, Cole said. It took me almost a year to realize the timing wasn't an accident. The same arc, the same vague language, the same 3-week pivot from valued to defective. Two of us now, in 2 different years, who had done the same thing, pointed at a number that didn't add up, and gotten the same treatment for it. Different year, different details, the same machine. That's not a coincidence. 2 is a pattern, and a pattern has an author. I didn't sleep much that night, but I wasn't grieving anymore. I was working, because the question had sharpened into something I could actually trace. Who needed that dashboard to stay green so badly that a person contradicting it became a threat to be managed rather than a colleague to be heard? And when I followed the program's reporting up the chain, it led to Delaney, a director whose reputation was built on that program's delivery, whose bonus was tied to its metrics, who had stood in front of the board and promised numbers that the working file said he wasn't going to hit. I want to be careful here because this is the part people always want to turn into a movie. Delaney wasn't a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. He was something far more ordinary and far more common. A man who had promised an outcome he could no longer deliver, watching the gap between the promise and the reality grow, with every incentive to keep that gap hidden for just one more quarter. In a situation like that, an honest report isn't information. It's a threat. My note didn't read to him as, "Here's a problem we can fix together." It read as, "Here's the person who could expose that the number is a lie." And the cheapest way to protect a number that won't survive scrutiny isn't to fix the number. That's expensive and humiliating. The cheapest way is to make sure that anyone who points at it can be dismissed. You don't argue with the message. You discredit the messenger. You build a quiet little record that says he has judgment problems. He's not collaborative. He raises things unconstructively, so that if he ever says it louder, no one has to listen. It was, I realized, the tedious possible solution to a problem that was never mine. And the worst part, the part that genuinely kept me up at night, was a thing I couldn't yet prove, but already knew in my gut. I was right. The program had slipped. The numbers I'd flagged were the real ones. Everything that had happened to me was in service of keeping a true thing hidden. So I went looking for the proof that I'd been right, because if the program really had slipped, the truth would have to surface somewhere eventually. Reality is patient that way. You can paint a dashboard green, but the actual schedule and the actual costs keep moving underneath the paint, and sooner or later someone has to write down where they really are. And I found it. Months after I'd been removed from anything to do with that program, there was a quiet revision. The timeline restated, the costs rebaselined, the delivery date moved to roughly where my flag numbers had said it would land all along. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just a correction slipped into the record, long after the messenger had been dealt with. The gap I'd raised had been real the entire time. They hadn't disagreed with me. They just needed me quiet until they could fix it on their own terms, without my name anywhere near the credit. I compared the revised figures against the ones I'd attached to my original note, line by line, the way I'd have reconciled any two reports. They didn't just point the same direction. They nearly matched. The schedule slip I'd estimated, the cost overrun I'd flagged. The official revision landed within a hair of both. I had been right to the decimal, months early, and the only thing my accuracy had earned me was a downgraded review and a quiet exit from the work. And that revision carried one more thing I hadn't expected. The paper trail around it touched the person who had signed my downgraded review. Because the review hadn't been written by Delaney. It had been written and signed by Hadley, my own direct manager. The man who'd sat across from me in that early, strange review and told me about my judgment. I'd assumed, in my more generous moments, that Hadley was just relaying something. The revision made it harder to believe he didn't know what he was part of. I asked him for one meeting. I owed him that, and I owed myself the chance to be wrong. I didn't bring accusations. I brought the timeline, and I brought the quiet question of why a 20-year record had turned in a single quarter. And I watched him do the thing that told me everything. He didn't defend the review. He didn't point to a single real failure, because there wasn't one. Instead, he reached for the edges. Calibration, he said. These ratings get shaped above my level. It came from higher up, and then, almost quietly, the line that confirmed it all, I softened it where I could. You don't soften something you believe is true. You soften something you know is a hit. In that one sentence, Hadley admitted that the review wasn't an assessment of my work. It was an instruction he'd carried out and felt bad enough about to try to blunt. That's the realism of these things. The deepest damage isn't done by the director protecting his number from a distance. It's done by the decent person in the middle who knows better and signs anyway, because pushing back would cost him something too. When I left Hadley's office, I wasn't angry anymore. I was decided. I waited for a while, honestly. The easy path was real. Take the corrected truth I now had for my own peace of mind, keep my head down, protect my reference, and move on. Nobody would have blamed me. But I kept thinking about Cole, spending a year believing he'd failed when he'd actually been right. I kept thinking about whoever would be next, because there's always a next as long as the method keeps working. So I built the packet, the timeline, the matching dates, Cole's account in his own words, and a quiet revision that proved the original concern had been valid all along. No fictives, no outright, just a sequence of dated facts laid end to end, the way I'd have built any report. And I took it to ethics and compliance, not to a lawyer first, not to a mass email, not to a war. To the one part of the company built to do exactly what I'd been doing alone at my kitchen table. Check whether the events happened in the order someone claimed, and whether the official story matched the record. I won't pretend it was dramatic. There was no confession, no director marched out by security. There almost never is. What there was a review. Compliance pulled the dates. They compared my report, my removal, and my rating change. They confirmed the program's later revision matched the concern I'd originally raised. And they reached the conclusion the timeline had been pointing at the whole time. This wasn't performance management. It was retaliation, and the thing I'd been retaliated for was telling the truth, which it turns out the company had a written policy protecting. The findings were quiet and serious. The retaliation was substantiated. My original concern was found to have been valid. Delaney was placed under review and moved off any role with authority over the people who reported on his programs. And the part I'm most proud of, the part that will outlast all of us, the company changed a rule. A negative performance action taken within a defined window after someone raises a protected concern now triggers an independent HR review before it can stand. You can no longer quietly turn a person's record sour right after they tell an inconvenient truth and have it just go through. Compliance asked to meet with me near the end. For one foolish second, I thought they were going to undo all of it. Give me back the project, the year, the clean record, the version of my career where I'd never sent that note. They couldn't, of course. What they offered instead was the truth in writing. My review was corrected, the retaliation documented, the vague concerns struck from my file. Cole's record was corrected too, a year late but real. And from someone fairly senior, an apology that I could tell cost something to give. I sat with whether that counted as winning. It's a strange kind of victory, the one where you're proven right and still paid the full price for it. The year was gone. The trust I'd had in the place, the simple foundational belief that an honest report would be received honestly, that didn't come back. You don't know what I'd learned, but here's what I got, and it turned out to be what I actually needed. I got the record set straight. For a long stretch, I'd carried the quiet fear that maybe I really had become difficult, maybe my judgment really had slipped, maybe 20 years of competence had somehow curdled without my noticing. The timeline answered that completely. I hadn't changed. I told the truth at a moment when the truth was expensive, and I'd been punished for the timing of my honesty, not the quality of my work. My judgment was never the problem. My judgment was the problem they couldn't afford me to have. Cole called me after it was over. He didn't say much. He just said that for a year he believed he wasn't good enough, and that seeing the record corrected, even this late, had loosened something he'd been carrying. I told him I knew exactly what he meant. We didn't need anyone destroyed. We just needed the record to stop lying about us. Hadley reached out too. Once, a short message saying he should have pushed back harder and that he was sorry he hadn't. I believed him. I didn't need him ruined. I needed him to say, out loud, that he'd known it was a hit and signed it anyway. He did, more or less. That was enough to set it down. I still work in this field. I still read every status report line by line, appendix and all. And I still report the numbers exactly as they are, even when the room would prefer a different color. People ask me sometimes whether all of it made me cynical, whether I've learned to keep my head down and let the dashboard stay green. I haven't, because here's the thing I understand now that I didn't before. You can paint a status green for a while. You can manage the messenger, move the dates, soften the review, and keep the gap hidden for another quarter. But reality keeps its own timeline underneath all of it, and eventually the real numbers surface exactly where they were always headed. I kept my own timeline too, carefully from the very first day. And in the end, mine was the one that turned out to be true. I sleep fine now.